There's this central, inescapable paradox to modern life, and it's something we almost never confront directly.
No, we really don't. We just sort of live in it.
Right. Because the very systems designed to keep you safe, to protect your physical well-being, or secure your bank accounts, or, stop terror attacks, they're the exact same systems capable of exerting total control over you.
Yeah, structurally, they are identical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Every mechanism built to shield you is simultaneously a mechanism that can track and monitor you. But instead of grappling with the terrifying scale of that, we just flatten it out.
Oh, totally. We treat it like a settings menu.
Yes. Like the security versus privacy debate is just a simple slider on your smartphone. Slide left for privacy, slide right for safety.
Which is just a profound misreading of what's actually happening. I mean, it's not a toggle switch.
Our expert guide is here, by the way, and I want to throw this right to you. Because the mission for this deep dive is to completely dismantle those everyday assumptions we hold about threat, surveillance, power, and freedom.
And just to be clear up front, we aren't here to pick a side.
No, not at all. We aren't declaring security the winner or privacy the champion. We're looking at the structural tension itself.
Right, the tension that defines our modern states and platforms. You cannot engineer a system with immense protective power without inherently creating the capacity for immense oppression.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because we have to start at the foundational instincts.
Mm-hmm.
Not the tech, but the raw human emotion driving this.
The gut feelings.
Yeah. The source document distills this into two incredibly stark sentiments. On one hand, you have the security instinct, which is basically, I would rather be watched than buried.
It's a powerful statement.
It really is.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, the absolute privacy instinct says, I would rather accept some danger than live inside a cage with better lighting.
What's fascinating here is that this is a genuine tragedy, and I mean that in the classical sense.
Like Shakespeare or the Greeks.
Exactly. In a classical tragedy, you don't have clear good and evil. You have two completely valid, compelling, but irreconcilable forces colliding. Neither side here is hallucinating the danger.
Right.
When someone says they'd rather be watched than buried, they are looking at the very real wolf outside the wall.
The actual physical threats.
Yeah. State collapse, cyber warfare, shutting down power grids, terrorism. They're staring into the abyss of chaos, and their core biological imperative is just screaming for order at any cost.
I think people who sit comfortably in highly stable environments often just dismiss that fear as paranoia.
Oh, constantly. It's a privilege to dismiss it.
Right. If you've lived in a neighborhood controlled by cartels, or if a cyber attack just wiped out the patient database at your city's hospital suddenly, philosophical debates about data privacy feel like an extreme luxury.
You just want the threat neutralized yesterday.
Exactly. But then you pivot to the privacy advocates. Are they just naive?
No, and this is crucial. They aren't ignoring the wolf outside. They know the wolf is there, but they're terrified of the guards locking the gates from the inside.
The people protecting them.
Right, because their historical lens shows them that institutions don't just protect. Their natural tendency is to accumulate power. Every emergency mechanism eventually leads to mission creep and the erosion of autonomy.
A cage with better lighting is still a cage.
Perfectly said.
That imagery is brutal. But to really grasp this, we need to stress test these instincts. Let's push both worldviews to their absolute extremes, starting with the security instinct and this idea of mission creep.
Yeah, let's look at the hidden costs there.
Think about it like this. Say you have a massive burglary problem in your neighborhood. So you go out and buy this state-of-the-art, heavy-duty smart lock for your front door. The threat is specific. The solution is targeted.
Makes total sense.
Right. But a year later, because of software updates, that lock is now logging what time you leave for work, tracking the facial biometrics of your visitors, and, I don't know, automatically sharing your daily routine with the local homeowners association.
And the police.
And the police. It didn't start as a surveillance net, but it quietly crept into that space.
Well, that's the exact life cycle of almost every major security apparatus built in the last century.
It never just stays on the front door.
Never. You build mass surveillance to track international terrorism. The public consensus is clear terrorism is an existential threat. Build the tool.
Get the bad guys.
Yeah, right. But once that massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure exists, the server farms, the wiretaps, the bureaucracy running it invariably looks at other problems.
They need to justify the budget.
Exactly. They say, well, we have this powerful system. It'd be irresponsible not to use it for human trafficking. Then it stretches to organized crime. Then fraud. then lower-level drug offenses.
Until you're using an anti-terrorism tool to find tax cheats.
Precisely. The categories stretch infinitely, and the databases never get deleted. We've actually seen this heavily litigated.
Like the European Court of Human Rights. The Big Brother Watch judgment.
Yes, the mechanics of that judgment are vital. The UK was doing bulk interception of communications, siphoning up millions of innocent citizens' metadata just to find a few needles in the haystack.
And the court said what?
The court found that operating a mass surveillance regime without robust oversight guarantees abuse. You're creating a secondary vulnerability. You build a centralized honeypot of personal data that bad actors or foreign adversaries can exploit.
Hold on, I want to stick with that concept of secondary vulnerability. Because the sharpest irony here is that extreme security measures can actually make us physically and digitally less secure.
It seems counterintuitive, but yes.
How does that hold up? If I build a stronger system to catch criminals, how am I less safe?
Let's look at digital encryption. Take the showdown between Apple and the FBI over the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone.
Oh, right. The FBI had the physical phone, but it was locked.
Locked with strong encryption. The pure security instinct says Apple must build a backdoor specialized software to bypass the lock so the FBI can get the data.
Which seems reasonable in a vacuum.
Yeah.
You have a localized threat, you need localized data.
But mathematically and architecturally, there is no such thing as a backdoor that only works for the good guys just this once.
Because if you make a key,
It exists, and if it exists, it can be stolen, leaked, or reverse engineered by hostile state actors or ransomware syndicates.
wow.
So to achieve episodic security, solving this one case, you permanently compromise the systemic security of hundreds of millions of devices belonging to innocent people, journalists, everyone,
You're basically burning down the reinforced vault to get into one safe deposit box.
leaving everyone else completely exposed.
Okay, but let's aggressively flip the script here.
Okay.
Because it's very easy to bash government overreach. But if we look at absolute privacy advocates, the people demanding unbreakable encryption and zero data retention, aren't they operating with a massive moral blind spot?
They absolutely are.
I mean, if privacy is absolute, doesn't that just create a playground for the worst people on Earth?
It creates an impenetrable shield for them. When a society decides that all monitoring is inherent tyranny, it lobotomizes its own ability to stop predation.
Right.
Mandating total privacy allows transnational cartels to launder billions without a trace. Corporate fraud goes uninvestigated. Human trafficking networks operate with absolute impunity in the dark.
We always picture the heroic whistleblower using encrypted messaging.
Right, but we ignore the human trafficking ring relying on that exact same encryption. This is what the text calls asymmetric risk,
Meaning what, exactly?
meaning who actually benefits from total systemic blind spots. The decent law-abiding citizen gets a psychological sense of autonomy, sure, but they remain fully exposed to the real-world consequences of crime. Meanwhile, the ruthless and the powerful actively exploit those blind spots.
The intelligence agencies aren't just hallucinating threats.
Exactly. They are staring at horrific crimes that are suddenly entirely invisible to them.
So we're caught between these two absolutist camps. The security absolutist operates purely on worst-case scenarios and evaluates systems by their intended use.
Assuming the machine only does what the manual says.
Right. But the privacy absolutist evaluates systems purely by potential abuse, operating on rigid first principles, and they miss the reality that a state too weak to see the predators can't protect its citizens.
Which is why the mature approach, what the text calls the holistic vision, is much uglier.
Uglier how?
It's more disciplined and less satisfying. No absolute slogans. It requires incredibly hard, uncomfortable questions. It doesn't just scream no on principle, nor does it hand over a blank check.
So what does it ask?
What precise threat is this addressing? Who authorizes the deployment? What's the adversarial audit process? When does the authorization automatically expire? And can we achieve this with a less intrusive method?
We can see this holistic vision trying to assert itself in real legal battles, right?
Sure.
Like the U.S. Supreme Court case, Carpenter v. United States.
Yes, that's a perfect illustration of this middle lane. It involved law enforcement getting months of historical cell site location information, CSLI, without a traditional warrant.
And for anyone who doesn't know, CSLI is basically the data your phone constantly generates just by existing, pinging cell towers every few seconds to maintain a signal.
Right. And through triangulation, the phone companies have a continuous minute-by-minute map of your physical location.
But historically, didn't the law say if you give data to a third party, you lose your privacy rights?
The third-party doctrine, exactly. But the Supreme Court, applying a more holistic vision, recognized that modern digital reality completely breaks that old analog logic. Carrying a phone isn't really voluntary anymore. It's practically mandatory to participate in society.
And the data isn't just a list of phone numbers. It's an intimate map of your life. It shows if you slept at your house or somewhere else.
It shows if you went to an oncologist, a union meeting, an addiction support group. So the court ruled that accessing this exposes the privacies of life at a scale previous generations couldn't even conceptualize. They required a warrant. They didn't dismantle the tool. They imposed an ironclad constraint on how it could be wielded.
That makes a lot of sense. But it's easy to talk about this structurally. When you look at how empires actually wielded this power historically, it gets pretty grim.
History shows us that these abstract fears are historically inevitable.
There's this fascinating parallel from the text, the Roman emergency dictatorship. When I first read that, I thought, how do ancient Roman politics map onto modern algorithmic surveillance? But the mechanics are identical.
The underlying logic of power hasn't changed in 2,000 years. The Roman Republic was deeply skeptical of concentrated power. They had the Senate, tribunes, consuls.
Checks and balances.
Right. But they knew that sometimes constitutional orders face existential crises. If Hannibal is marching over the Alps, the slow deliberation of a democratic Senate means the state gets destroyed.
So they engineered a crisis mechanism, the office of the dictator.
A legal temporary grant of absolute power. The deal was, you get absolute authority for 6 months. You defeat the invading army, save the state, and then immediately surrender the power and go back to normal life.
Like Cincinnatus. He was plowing his fields, became dictator, crushed the enemy, and went right back to farming.
That's the idealized myth. But the historical reality is that emergency powers inevitably drift toward permanence when institutional norms decay.
Mission creep in ancient Rome.
Exactly. Over centuries, the definition of an emergency blurred. Is a riot an emergency? A grain shortage? The justification stretched, time limits were ignored, and eventually Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon and forces the Senate to declare him dictator in perpetuity.
He used the mechanism designed to save the Republic to dismantle it. That is bone-chilling.
The mechanism is ancient, the costume just changes.
Yeah, today it's not a general in a toga asking to fight Gaul. It's an intelligence director in a suit asking Congress for warrantless metadata collection to fight cyber terrorism.
The risk is the same. Once granted, the bureaucratic machine fights to the death to never return the power.
Which brings us to the psychological architecture of all this. Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon and Foucault's reading of it.
The panopticon is the ultimate metaphor for how visibility creates control. Bentham designed a prison centered around a single guard tower. The cells are in a circle, backlit.
So the guard can see every cell, but the inmates can't see the guard.
Right. The prisoner never knows if they're being watched at any specific second. That uncertainty is the genius and the horror of it. If you might be watched, you have to assume you are always being watched.
And Foucault took that and applied it to the modern administrative state.
He argued the true hidden cost of surveillance isn't just loss of data, it's the psychological internalization of the guard.
You become your own jailer.
Yes, the system doesn't need physical force to modify your actions. Your own paranoia does the work. It shapes your identity and behavior in real time. You move from a society where you're punished for breaking a rule to a society where the environment is engineered so you never even consider breaking it.
Here's where it gets really interesting, looking at how this plays out globally today. Take the U.S. post-9/11 approach, the Patriot Act, FISA Section 702.
The U.S. post-9/11 response is the textbook manifestation of the Roman emergency response. The public demanded immediate prevention. The Patriot Act massively expanded surveillance with drastically reduced oversight.
And FISA Section 702 is still so controversial.
It allows intelligence agencies to target non-U.S. persons outside the country. But because of how global internet traffic works, millions of communications from U.S. citizens are incidentally swept up in it.
Security advocates say it's vital for counterterrorism. Privacy advocates call it a massive warrantless backdoor.
And the brutal battles in Congress over its reauthorization prove this tension is unresolved.
But the U.S. isn't the only model. The EU is trying to balance the blade with the GDPR.
The EU is attempting to enforce the holistic vision through sheer bureaucracy. The GDPR imposes incredibly strong data protections for citizens against corporate surveillance.
They still need to catch criminals.
Right, so they had to build parallel, highly complex legal frameworks like the Law Enforcement Directive to allow police to share data. The friction between their privacy ideals and real-world security creates massive legal headaches.
Like the Schrems 2 ruling striking down data sharing with the U.S.,
Exactly.
and then pivot to India's Aadhaar system, a biometric ID for over 1 billion people.
Breathtaking scale. Fingerprints and iris scans tied to a 12-digit number. The security and efficiency instinct was powerful. Eliminate welfare fraud and help unbanked citizens by tying aid to a biometric API.
But the privacy and human rights backlash was enormous.
Because if you centralize 1 billion people's biometrics, you create an unprecedented honeypot. And beyond data theft, if the API fails, if a scanner in a rural village won't connect, or a laborer's fingerprints are worn down, that person ceases to exist to the state.
They can't get food rations or use a bank. Citizenship becomes a conditional database entry.
Reliant on perfect technological execution.
The UN actually issued a warning about all this. They essentially said, our old frameworks, thinking about a detective tapping a single phone line, are completely obsolete.
We aren't just dealing with human agents anymore. The UN warned that the true modern threat is algorithmic categorization at scale.
AI sorting entire populations.
Yes, public space monitoring, facial recognition, commercial spyware like Pegasus that uses zero-click exploits to compromise a phone without you even clicking a link.
So the goal isn't just investigating a suspect anymore.
It's the continuous automated extraction of life patterns to predict future behavior.
And no matter the tool, the expansion is always justified by the word necessary. But how does that definition stretch? The source text outlines this terrifying 5-stage progression of surveillance expansion.
It's a progression of institutional logic that's almost impossible to stop.
Let's walk through it. Stage 1 is the legitimate threat. We need a massive tool to stop an imminent terrorist attack. Everyone is on board.
Stage 2 is preventative expansion. They say, it's great we stopped the attack, but we need broader data to catch the next one earlier.
Stage 3 is pattern detection. They aren't looking for specific individuals anymore. They're looking for statistical anomalies.
Stage 4 is normalization. The emergency powers are just the baseline operation of the state now.
And Stage 5 is repurposing. The tool built for weaponized anthrax is now used by local police to track petty theft or monitor protests.
I love the analogy of the fishing net for this.
It's perfect. You convince the public there are great white sharks threatening the beach. So you weave a net with massive holes designed to let normal fish pass through and catch only the huge predators. But then the fishermen, the bureaucracy, realize they have this incredible net.
So they tighten the mesh. We need to catch smaller sharks. Then predatory fish. Then invasive species. They keep tightening it until the holes are gone. They're just scooping up the water itself, and every living thing is trapped.
I want to zero in on the shift from Stage 1 to Stage 3, because this is where law enforcement stops acting like a detective and starts acting like an oracle. You go from tracking someone for what they did to tracking them for what they statistically resemble.
This is predictive policing.
It sounds like sci-fi, but it's happening.
Yeah.
How does an algorithm actually predict where robberies will happen tomorrow?
Well, it doesn't predict the future. It only analyzes the past. You have to feed the neural network massive data sets to train it. And what is the data? Historical arrest records.
But historical arrest records aren't an objective map of where crime happened. They're a map of where police chose to make arrests.
Precisely. If a department historically targeted specific minority neighborhoods for drug possession while ignoring similar drug use in affluent college dorms, that bias is hard-coded into the data.
Human prejudice converted into mathematical weights.
Yes. The algorithm spits out a heat map, telling the police commander to send extra patrols right back to that same minority neighborhood.
And because there are more police there, they naturally find more infractions, make more arrests, and feed that new data right back into the algorithm.
A mathematically validated feedback loop of systemic bias. The system creates the reality it claims to be predicting. You're watched because your zip code or demographic markers are clustered as high risk.
Let's talk about the political illusion surrounding all of this, because we assume the political right is always pro-security and the left is always pro-privacy. But the text proves this is entirely situational.
It's a complete fiction. Politicians and citizens actually prioritize privacy when they fear the system, and they prioritize security when they trust the system.
Impartially speaking, based on the text, how does this hypocrisy play out?
We'll take the traditional political area. Right. They generally emphasize law and order and will aggressively support expanding intelligence and police surveillance. But the absolute second an agency they distrust, say, the IRS or Public Health Administration, asks for data collection to track finances or vaccine compliance, they instantly become the fiercest privacy advocates on earth.
Quoting Orwell and warning about the surveillance state.
Exactly. And the traditional political left does the exact same facial recognition. But when it comes to combating domestic extremism they oppose or managing public health crises, they suddenly demand that tech companies and governments implement sweeping monitoring systems.
So their principles are entirely subordinate to power. If your side controls the machine, you want the machine to have infinite data because you trust your side's intentions.
But if the opposition wins an election and inherits the machine, you suddenly rediscover the vital necessity of civil liberties.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the institutional leadership of both sides broadly agrees on expanding state power. They argue on TV about how the data is used, but neither side wants to delete the database.
Data equals control, and institutional power never voluntarily relinquishes control.
If this tension warps politics, it also warps all our foundational values. The text calls this the anchor axis. It's a metadimension bending all other philosophical axes. Let's run through these quickly. Individual versus collective.
Security demands a collective logic centralizing data and demanding individual sacrifice to protect the herd. Privacy is radically individualistic, asserting the individual boundary is sacred regardless of the statistical benefit to the group.
Idealism versus pragmatism.
Security is the brutal pragmatist. It says people are dangerous, we must survive, and ideals don't matter if the city is burning. Privacy is the uncompromising idealist. It says human dignity matters more than sheer survival if the cost is our humanity.
Centralization versus decentralization. This is hard database architecture.
Absolutely. You cannot have systemic security without centralized data lakes. Connecting the dots requires all the data in one place. But strong privacy requires decentralization information silos, end-to-end encryption. Privacy fragments power, security consolidates it.
Okay, let me push back here. We can analyze these axes all day, but what is the actual bedrock belief driving someone's worldview?
If you strip away all the rhetoric, you arrive at the absolute bedrock truth. You don't actually believe in security or privacy. What you believe in is a judgment about human nature.
Meaning what?
Who should hold power and how much do you trust them with it? Do you design a system assuming competent, benevolent actors will run it, or assuming inevitable, ruthless corruption?
Wow. So it's all just a proxy war over trust.
Entirely. If you assume good actors, you build for security. You grant the emergency powers. If you study history and assume corruption is inevitable, you build for privacy. You build the constraints.
Since we can't escape this tension, we need a functional way to live within it. The text proposes the dynamic tension model based on the asymmetry of damage.
Right. Failures of security and failures of privacy do not look the same.
Exactly. Why does the system naturally overcorrect towards security?
Because of how human psychology perceives damage. A security failure is spectacular. A hijacking, a mass shooting, a ransomware attack, it's immediate, it bleeds, it causes panic, and people demand action.
But a failure of privacy over surveillance is slow and invisible.
It doesn't bleed. It's behavioral conditioning over decades. You don't see a headline that says, democracy died by 4% today due to algorithms. Because security has political urgency, leaders will always overprotect security to save themselves politically.
So the optimal system must intentionally overprotect privacy just to balance the scales. And there are 5 rules of dynamic tension to do this. Rule 1, continuous justification.
Security can't just be justified during a crisis and operate forever. It must constantly prove its worth. Every intelligence program needs an expiration date. What is the current threat? What is the mathematical success rate? And what is the failure rate? How many innocent people were swept up?
Rule 2, privacy as default. Privacy isn't earned. It's the baseline state. You aren't tracked unless there is specific individualized cause reviewed by an adversarial judicial body.
Rule 3, reversible power. If a surveillance tool is built, society must possess the actual capability to turn it off if it's abused.
But government IT systems are a mess. They build data lakes, and later the engineers say, we don't actually know where the data is anymore, it's too embedded.
If a system is too embedded to roll back, it's already too powerful.
Rule 4, decentralized visibility, centralized accountability. Don't put all the data in one honeypot, silo it. But centralize the oversight, create a highly funded adversarial body whose only job is to hunt for intelligence abuses.
And Rule 5, which ties back to trust. Designed for worst-case leadership. So what does this all mean? It means you don't build a surveillance apparatus for the leader you love.
Because the architecture outlives the administration.
Build it for the political figure you fear the absolute most. If the thought of your worst enemy wielding this tool terrifies you, you must not build it at all.
These rules are great on paper, but technology has fundamentally broken old assumptions. Let's move into the deep psychology of this. We have to dismantle the classic argument: if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to fear.
That fallacy assumes laws are always just. History is a graveyard of regimes that criminalize dissent or identity. When laws become unjust, nothing to hide is a death sentence. But beyond that, it ignores modern context collapse.
How does context collapse work?
Human communication relies on context. Say a teenager tats a darkly sarcastic joke to a friend. In context, it's a joke. 10 years later, an AI background check scrapes that message. It strips away the time, the friendship, the sarcasm. It reduces a human moment to a binary data point and flags them as high risk.
So privacy isn't about hiding wrongdoing. It's about preserving agency over your own narrative.
Yes. Without privacy, you are whatever the algorithm decides you are. And the battlefield is no longer just the state. It's ad tech, social media, data brokers.
Which brings us to the chilling effect, the me versus Max model and the thought filter.
Me is your raw, private, internal, self, unfiltered thoughts, doubts. Max is your external, observable self, the persona you present to society.
And the thought filter is the membrane between them.
Exactly. In a free society, you control that filter. But under pervasive digital surveillance, the filter is externalized. The institutions and algorithms become the filter.
And because they are opaque, you don't know how they're interpreting your data.
You don't know if reading a Wikipedia article or clicking a link will ruin your credit score. When you don't know the rules of the invisible judge, you aggressively self-censor. You conform to the safest version of existence based on how you might be perceived.
It's behavioral conditioning. You police your own thoughts before they become actions.
This raises an important question, the ultimate trade-off. You cannot eliminate risk without eliminating freedom. Total safety requires total control.
Do you want a world where threats slip through because we refuse to watch everyone? Or a sterile world where nothing slips through because everything is watched and controlled?
If you build a system that perfectly prevents every threat, you've built the very thing you should fear most.
The debate isn't a slider between safety and secrecy. It's a fundamental question of what it means to be human. Do you want to be perfectly understood and entirely visible, or unpredictable and retain your privacy? I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought. We've talked about policing our own thoughts, but imagine the next generation, a generation born completely native to total digital visibility, where every metric is tracked from birth by algorithms. Will the internal psychological tension between me and Max even exist for them? Or will the very human concept of unpredictability simply be evolved out of the human psyche entirely? Keep questioning the systems around you. Thanks for joining this deep dive.